Dr. Lugovskyy, it's great to see you today.
Very nice to be here, Jason.
Some economists, for instance, Professor Hankey from Johns Hopkins University, has estimated that inflation in Russia is really probably closer to 24%. But if that's true, why doesn't the ruble change in value to the dollar? Currently, one ruble is equal to about 88.3 uh, rubles. Why is that? Why do we not see huge numbers, huge changes in the value of the dollar to the ruble?
So obviously the situation in Russia is now somewhat different from how it used to be in the Soviet Union, because in Soviet Union it was impossible to buy ruble, but there are still some similarities, right? So in Soviet Union, dollar was priced as 0.69 of rubles, right? So 69 kopecks. So 1 kopek is like 1 cent. And so that exchange rate stayed there for decades, right? And so in a way, that's what kind of Russia is now trying to achieve. And it's true that you can actually buy rubles as a person and up to a certain amount. But for businesses, even if you can buy dollars, there are very limited possibilities of how you can use those dollars, right? So you cannot transfer them abroad. Many times you cannot buy any goods for those dollars, or at least the goods which you want to buy, right? And you cannot invest them abroad. And so that greatly decreased the demand for dollars from Russian businesses, and the demand from population is quite limited. And it should be also said that Russia was a huge oil and gas exporter, and Putin was preparing for the war, and they accumulated significant amount of dollars, and so they can actually sustain the exchange rate, given that this exchange rate is based mainly on the demand from population and much less from businesses these days. So you said that, let's say, the dollar exchange rate is the same for last, let's say, 2 years. But then if prices of basic goods increase by 50% each year, so it means that the dollar price in Russia increases each year. And so Russians are not paid in dollars, they are paid in rubles. Their salaries are not increasing at that rate, if at all. And in terms of the real GDP, in terms of the ability of consumers to buy those goods, the per capita income decreases at a great rate. And this focus on dollar was justified and is justified for countries where you have, free movement of currencies. It's not the case in Russia, right? So if you have $2 million in Russia, then you would need to find a way how to spend them within Russia. You cannot do much with those dollars anywhere else, except for some selected companies which have government connections. And they are ordered to behave, and they are ordered to sell some of those dollars from their export revenues, right? So there's this huge effort to keep the exchange rate the same, even if it's costly for the economy, because that's something which is good for propaganda, and which is something which is good for not making population to panic. But it becomes irrelevant because the ruble is kind of currency which is not usable anywhere outside of Russia, and they make other currencies also not allowing them free movement across borders, except for maybe some selected currencies. And so that's why they can maintain dollar at, let's say, 0.90 rubles per dollar indefinitely, but then their inflation in real terms will be 20, 30, 40, 50% every year. So under normal circumstances, that would not be sustainable, because then you would have either inflow of capital into Russia and buying dollars at Russian exchange rate, outflow of dollars from Russia, but those channels are limited. And so that's basically their way to keep the exchange rate constant.
Despite these negative indicators, though, there are some very good indicators. What do you make of the fact that Russia says its unemployment rate is less than 3%? Is that an indication of an incredibly strong economy?
So that's typically an indication of economies with high inflation, right? So if you don't have means to save, and if your salary or wages in real terms decrease over time, then everybody has to work, because you cannot depend on your savings, and you cannot depend on the government payments to those who cannot find jobs because those payments are just not sufficient for survival. Plus, even if you're retiree and you're getting some pension, even in those cases, many times you have to work extra to make a sufficient amount of money to survive, right? So there is a standard relationship between inflation and employment. The higher the inflation, the higher the employment.
So let me ask a different question though. You've seen recently, and you even mentioned just now, that Russia is doing away with the preferable mortgages that it had, which were very low rates, which seems to make sense because when you look at the key interest rate, for instance, it's now 18%, and it's predicted to go even higher. So Russia's central bank is trying to fight inflation. It seems that it wants to reduce the amount of ruble circulating, hence why it's increasing the percentage on loans, namely mortgages. But prices in Russia for real estate, namely new apartment buildings, has gone absolutely crazy. The numbers have been going up double digits for a couple of years now. What do you make of that? And could that be a sign that it's creating a bubble?
So it definitely creates a bubble. So one of the reasons for that is exactly that you don't have many other trustable sources of savings, right? So you can potentially, if you want to, you keep your money in rubles, and you can even deposit them in a bank and collect the interest rate of, let's say, 18%, right? But the fact that population is not necessarily eager too much to do that, and they would rather invest in real estate, is that because they have high expectations of default. They have high expectations that one day there will be even higher inflation. And so all these savings and all those interest rates of 18% will be nothing compared to hyperinflation. And so traditionally in Russia, and I guess in many other countries, but especially in Russia, investing in real estate, investing in land, maybe it's the only option to save money. And you don't want to save money in dollars either, because you cannot transfer those dollars abroad. And at some point, it's not clear what will be the regulation of the currency market in Russia. And so how you'd be, like even in dollars. So we said that exchange rate is the same, but prices increase, let's say 30, 40% per year for consumer goods. So it means that if you choose to keep money in dollars, then every year you'd be losing 30 or 40% of value in those dollars based on domestic prices expressed in Russian rubles, right? And so that's another reason why maybe population is not that eager to buy dollars. They try to find other ways. And again, traditional ways to save would be to buy either real estate, or in the past, there were like cars. You buy a car and you keep it for 20 years or so. So that's what's happening in the Russian market of real estate, and that's what's happening in the Russian market of cars, specifically domestically produced cars.
It's really interesting. Let me ask you just one last question. Overall, you don't seem very optimistic about Russia's current economic situation. Looking forward, how bad do you really think it is? And at what point will we reach a stage where it becomes acute? What's going to happen next to the Russian economy?
Over the last 2 years, we've seen the resilience of, I wouldn't say economy, but the ability of the government to keep the population under control, right? And to some extent, if you go back historically, you go back to, I don't know, Stalin's times, or even Khrushchev times and all that, right? So we can see that Russia has developed this repressive machinery which allows to keep people under control, even if you start having rationing food, right? So you would basically be getting more police, and you'd be throwing people to jail, even like for small hint of unsatisfaction, which to some extent is already happening now, right? And so that's what's going on. And so from that perspective, right, so since they mastered this oppression apparatus, they might be okay. The only thing which might seriously challenge that is that if you start having those conditions which are life-threatening, so if you start having no electricity, no heating, especially during colder times, right? So we can actually see how the situation will not be controllable anymore, even if you have a lot of police, right? Because if people don't have heating, including police, right, so they will not necessarily then obey the orders, and also population will not care because they either freeze to death or they would have somehow to oppose the current regime, right? And so if we see this situation being intensified, and that can be many reasons, so that can be the capacity of Russian oil and gas producers to decrease because their equipment is becoming old and not replaced and depreciates, or it can be because Ukraine destroys their infrastructure. You can start seeing some type of revolt situations in different parts of Russia. And we actually start seeing that intensifying to some extent in Caucasus, and we can also see that intensifying maybe in the regions which are close to Ukraine, where these problems are more severe. And I do think they will become even more severe closer to winter.
Well, then we have something to look forward to. Professor Lugovsky, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. It was nice being here.